Have you ever walked into a brightly lit room where everyone dressed like they owned the world, and with just a glance, they told you, you don't belong here? Have you ever stood at a service counter, a place that should exist to serve you, only to be treated like you weren't worthy, simply because of your skin color, your clothes, or the unspoken assumption that you were from a different class? That pain, it's sharp like a blade. No one has to touch you. Just a look, a tone of voice, is enough to make you feel small in a space built with the very tax dollars and labor of people like you. But what happens when the person they look down on isn't just worthy of being there, but actually holds the power to decide the fate of the very place that rejected him? What happens when the man they dismiss today becomes the one they'll beg tomorrow? This isn't a dream. It's not a movie. This is how one man turned silence into a weapon, humiliation into a lesson, and a simple nod into a sentence for an entire system that thought it was untouchable. This is the story of Marcus Bell, a black CEO who walked into an upscale bank as just another customer and was refused service in front of people who smirked at his presence. But only 24 hours later, he came back. Not for an apology, but to close the biggest deal in that bank's history silently, but loud enough to expose every prejudice that had chained him his whole life. If you've ever witnessed or lived through moments like this, hit like, share this story, and subscribe to this channel. Because every story we tell isn't just a twist, it's a mirror reflecting the society we live in. And now, let's go back to where it all began at a bank counter, where a seed of arrogance was planted, only to be met with one unforgettable reversal. The bank glowed under the morning lights, the polished stone floor reflecting every step. The scent of expensive perfume mingled with the woody fragrance of the furniture, that distinct smell of power only familiar to those who live comfortably among the elite. At the VIP counter, customers wore tailored suits, watches that gleamed like trophies, and faces armored with the confidence forged from years at the top. And in the middle of all that shine, Marcus Bell walked in wearing a simple charcoal polo and a pair of worn khakis. He didn't need to look up to know how they were staring at him. He'd seen those looks his entire life, detached, cautious, like he was an intruder. A woman, waiting her turn, glanced at him, her lips curving into a smile that could only be described as mocking. An old man in a gray suit adjusted his glasses, staring at Marcus like he was trying to figure out what business someone like him had in a place like this. Marcus walked toward the counter, forcing his steps to stay even, though the silence made every tap of his shoes echo louder than it should. The woman behind the counter, young, hair neatly tied back, was typing away at her keyboard. But when her eyes landed on him, her fingers slowed, then stopped. She looked up, scanning him from head to toe. No greeting, just a stiff nod. Then the impatient tapping of her pen against the desk, a rhythm that carried a very clear message. You don't belong here. Marcus took a deep breath, letting his eyes sweep the room. The walls displayed framed art of bustling cityscapes. The waiting tables were stocked with imported mineral water and neatly folded financial newspapers. But none of that warmth reached him. This wasn't hospitality. It was exclusion, wrapped up in expensive packaging and sold as civilized. Marcus wondered, what do they see when they look at me, a stranger? Someone who doesn't meet their invisible criteria, or simply a black man in a space they believed belonged only to a certain kind of powerful? He kept his face neutral, but inside, the old memories surfaced, memories of reading rooms like this long before he ever had the power to walk into them on his own terms. And now, just like then, he knew this wasn't just a bank. This was a test, and every pair of eyes in the room was grading him against a standard no one dared to say out loud. He hadn't spoken a word, and yet his silence made them restless. And in that moment, Marcus realized this game. He could flip it on them whenever he chose. And this was only the beginning. The woman at the counter didn't bother to add a polite greeting. She glanced back at her screen, then at him again, her voice steady but icy. "Are you sure you're in the right place? This is the priority banking desk." It wasn't a question. It was a reminder. She wasn't asking to help, she was nudging him out. That tone, Marcus knew it well. Trained to sound polite, used like a velvet-covered blade. Before he could respond, a man appeared, the manager, no doubt. Black suit, navy tie, every step measured as though even his walk had been rehearsed. He stopped in front of Marcus without so much as a hello. His eyes scanned Marcus slowly, deliberately, like he was appraising an object, not a person. Finally, the man spoke, voice clipped and cold. "We only serve qualified clients here. You can come back when you have the proper documentation." Qualified. Marcus almost laughed, as if power could be reduced to the documents they chose to recognize. They saw his skin, his polo shirt, the frayed strap of his watch, and immediately dropped him into the unqualified box. The whispers started. A blonde woman leaned in toward her companion, whispering something that made them both chuckle. An older man nodded to himself. Like everything was unfolding exactly as he'd expected. Their laughter wasn't loud, but to Marcus, it pricked like needles. He didn't reply right away. He let the silence linger, let them think they'd succeeded in putting him in his place. And then, in a calm, steady voice, Marcus said, "I understand." That's all. But his eyes glinted the kind of glint only someone well-versed in power games could recognize. The manager probably thought he'd solved a small problem, but Marcus, he saw a much bigger opportunity opening in front of him. He knew they couldn't imagine that the man they had just dismissed was the one who would decide this bank's future in just a few hours. They didn't know, but they would. And when that moment came, they'd remember every word they'd said today. Marcus stood there for another long moment, letting the weight of their arrogance settle into the room. Then he locked eyes with the manager, those cold, hollow eyes so used to deciding who was worthy and who wasn't. Those eyes had made plenty of people shrink, but Marcus didn't. He'd walked through too many rooms like this to ever feel small again. He smiled, not a polite smile, not one meant to appease, a thin, sharp smile just enough to unsettle the ones watching. Then he said, voice quiet but cutting, "All right, I'll come back when you're ready to serve me." No raised voice, no theatrics, just a sentence, calm and heavy, hanging in the air like a challenge. Then he turned and walked out. His steps were steady, unhurried, the sound of his shoes hitting the stone floor mixed with the muted whispers behind him. Someone chuckled nervously, trying to cover their own unease. Another frowned, clearly puzzled at how a man they'd just humiliated could leave looking so unbothered. But they didn't know Marcus. He wasn't walking away to give up. He'd never been the type to give up. He was walking away to return in a way they couldn't even begin to imagine. As he stepped out of the bank, the morning sunlight hit his face. Marcus tilted his head back, breathing deeply. The anger inside him wasn't a firestorm. It was quieter, deeper like magma beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to erupt. In his mind, the pieces were already falling into place. This wasn't just a personal insult. This was an opening, a power game, one Marcus knew he could win. And when he did, it wouldn't just be for himself, it would be a reminder to them that their assumptions about skin color, about status, could be shattered in an instant. Marcus glanced back at the bank, almost laughing to himself. They thought they were in control. But the game had just begun. And they had no idea that the storm heading their way would wipe out everything they thought was untouchable. Marcus left the bank, but what happened inside didn't stay behind him. It pulled him somewhere farther back, to a time he thought he'd buried. His childhood rose up like an old film reel, messy and quietly painful. He saw himself at 10 years old, tagging along with his mother to a corner grocery store. Little Marcus cared only about the candy aisle, his eyes lighting up at the shelves of sweets. But then he noticed a man in a store uniform trailing them. When Marcus slowed down, the man slowed. When Marcus stopped, the man pretended to rearrange items on a shelf. His mother noticed too. Her hand clamped gently but firmly on his shoulder. She didn't say a word, just quietly led him out of the store. But Marcus still heard the man whisper to his co-worker, "Keep an eye on them." That day, Marcus didn't fully understand. He just knew he'd been seen as a threat, only because of his skin. That look, those following footsteps, left his first scar. Then came the days at school. He was a strong student, but that didn't matter to his math teacher, the one who once called his mother in for a meeting and flatly said, "He doesn't have what it takes for college." No grade on a report card could change the way she saw him. Marcus still remembered that afternoon, his mother holding him tightly on the walk home, whispering, "Don't let anyone tell you you can't. You will, they just don't want to see it." Her words were medicine, but the scar remained. And then came other moments, being stopped by a store guard for a random check, being rejected for a job with the excuse of not enough experience, while the candidate chosen had less on paper than he did. Each moment small by itself, but together they built an invisible wall, pushing him into the corner where they thought he belonged. Marcus grew up surrounded by these tiny cuts. They didn't break him, but they shaped him. They taught him how to read the world. In many places, people like him didn't have to do anything wrong to be treated as if they already had. Now, standing on the sidewalk outside the bank, Marcus realized his anger wasn't just about how those bankers treated him this morning. It was about how familiar it felt. They were repeating the same pattern the world had imposed on him since childhood: judging, diminishing, excluding. Marcus exhaled. They thought they were winning every time they pushed someone like him out. But what they didn't understand was that every scar had taught him how to stand taller and strike smarter, and this time he'd show them exactly what those lessons had made of him. Because some battles start with a scar and end with a reversal no one sees coming. Marcus Bell was no longer that little boy avoiding the suspicious gaze of a store clerk, nor the student whose teacher doubted his potential. He was now a man in a position most people only dream about: CEO of Aurora Capital, an investment firm behind landmark deals that could shift markets with a single signature. His office sat atop a glass skyscraper, a place where billion-dollar decisions carried his name. But power and wealth couldn't erase what society had carved into the way others saw him. He was reminded of it every time he stepped into spaces deemed exclusive. It wasn't overt insults or blatant questions. It was in the quick glances, the measuring stares, the polite smiles hiding the unspoken thought, "What's he doing here?" Marcus had once tried to ignore it. He once believed success would silence them, but reality was different. The more accomplished he became, the tighter those stares gripped him, as if they were searching for cracks, proof that he didn't belong in their world. There were nights at lavish dinners where he was often the only black man in the room. People made small talk, offering empty pleasantries while their eyes drifted elsewhere. He listened to their stories about yachts, golf resorts, and circles they assumed he could never be part of. They didn't ask about Aurora Capital. They didn't realize his firm could easily acquire the very projects they bragged about. Marcus learned to respond with silence. Not out of defeat, but because silence was often the best mask for a meticulously planned counterattack. He let them think they'd won their game of classification. In truth, he was observing, remembering every face, every word, knowing that one day they'd pay for their arrogance with the very things they cherished most: power and reputation. Standing outside that bank, Marcus understood this better than ever. Those people didn't see a CEO. They only saw a black man in a polo shirt, and that blindness would be the very blade they'd turn on themselves. Because they had no idea that the man they belittled today held the power to alter their future. The car door shut, sealing away the noise of the city. Marcus sank into the cold leather seat, eyes fixed on the passing crowd through the tinted glass. Strangers who, in this moment, had nothing to do with him. In the quiet, he let out a short laugh. It wasn't cheerful, nor was it smug. It sounded more like commentary on life, as if he'd just witnessed an amateur play performed with misplaced confidence. Shaking his head, he muttered softly just for himself. They can't imagine the man they turned away today as the same one they'll be begging tomorrow. The words hung in the car, quiet but heavy. He didn't say them to comfort himself, nor to inflate his ego. He said them because he saw the irony. The people most secure in their power rarely realize when they've walked straight into a trap. Marcus leaned back, closing his eyes, letting memory and reality merge. For years, he'd lived through scenes like this, where his power and success meant nothing against a prejudice etched into the gaze of others. And that's why he laughed now. Not out of triumph, but because he recognized fate had just handed him an opportunity to turn humiliation into a lesson for the entire system. He opened his eyes and glanced at his watch. It wasn't a luxury piece, but it had been with him since his first days building his company. A reminder of where he started, and of those who once thought he'd never make it this far. He ran a thumb across its worn strap, as if speaking to himself. We made it here, and they still can't see. A faint smile appeared, the kind worn by someone holding a card his opponents didn't even know was in play. Marcus knew that within 24 hours the power map would shift, and when it did, those same people standing tall and smug at the VIP counter would be the ones bowing low. He leaned forward, pressing a button on the console. The car rolled out of the lot, heading toward his office, the place where the next moves would be set in motion. And once the pieces were in place, the game would begin. A game Marcus knew he wouldn't lose. The boardroom on the 43rd floor of Aurora Capital was designed like a glass fortress. Afternoon light poured through the transparent walls, stretching across the massive walnut table where Marcus sat. The air here was nothing like the bank that morning. No probing stares, no condescending words. This was his domain, where every decision, every signature he put on paper could alter the fate of a company, or even an entire industry. Marcus sat at the head of the table, arms loosely crossed. His team lined either side strategy advisors, legal experts, the CFO. Faces that had gone to battle with him through deal after deal now watched his every move. Knowing one thing about the man at the helm, he didn't speak often, but when he did, he redefined the rules. On the large screen at the front of the room, the merger report glowed. Aurora Capital was in talks to become the largest shareholder of the very bank that had turned Marcus away the day before. That same name now sat neatly inside a folder stamped Priority Transaction. Marcus couldn't help but smirk at the irony. "How's it looking?" Marcus asked, his voice low, clipped. The CFO immediately replied revenue was up, but the bank's board was fractured, desperate for a strong investor to steady the ship. Aurora had been invited to the table with highly favorable terms, a near certain win. Marcus stayed silent, eyes on the report, but mind replaying the image of the black-suited manager from yesterday, the one who'd told him he didn't qualify. That phrase echoed in his head now like a crude joke. He turned to his legal team. "I want this deal moving on schedule, no delays, and keep my identity off the table." One advisor raised a brow. "You don't want the bank's leadership to know who's behind the deal." Marcus tilted his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "No, let them show their true faces before they know who they're really talking to." The room fell into silence. It wasn't a rash answer. It was Marcus playing chess. Let them feel secure in their little game of power until he flipped the entire board. Another advisor asked, "So, what's the ultimate goal here, Marcus?" He didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his chair, eyes on the horizon where the sunlight was turning a deep gold. Sometimes answering too soon ruined the best part the moment when your opponent realized they'd walked right into your noose. A young advisor finally broke the quiet, his voice careful but edged with frustration. "Marcus, we have endless options. Why work with a bank that disrespected you?" The question made the room still. It was what many of them were thinking but didn't dare say out loud. Choosing a different partner would be easier, cleaner, no lingering taste of shaking hands with people who'd spit on your dignity. Marcus didn't answer right away. He rested his elbows on the table, fingers interlaced. His gaze swept over each of them, weighing their readiness for what was coming. Finally, he spoke, voice low and cold as ice. No. One word, but it struck the glass walls like a blade. He leaned forward, his eyes darkening. I want them to bow. No substitutions. The air in the room turned heavy. One of the senior attorneys pursed his lips, tapping his finger on the table, an old habit when he was holding back a counter-argument. Others exchanged uneasy glances. No one spoke. If we walk away, Marcus continued, his tone steady, they'll never learn. They'll think they can treat anyone that way and still get away with it. He paused, then let a thin, inscrutable smile spread across his face. But if we stay, and they're forced to sign my terms, that won't just be a deal, it'll be a lesson they'll never forget. A young female advisor exhaled softly, part unease, part awe. Marcus had just turned what could have been a simple business transaction into a masterclass in revenge. Not revenge through words, but through power and irrefutable reality. He leaned back. As if the discussion was over, we move forward, exactly as planned. And when I meet them, I'll be the one setting the rules. The final words hung in the air, untouched, unchallenged. And somewhere in his mind, Marcus could already see it the exact moment those arrogant men realized they'd stepped neatly into the trap he'd laid. Marcus leaned in slightly. His next words meant only for those willing to truly listen. His voice dropped, each syllable landing on the table like a stone making ripples. When I meet them, I don't want them knowing who I am. Several heads shot up, stunned. Keeping a principal's identity hidden in a deal of this magnitude was far from normal. You want them to think, one advisor began, but Marcus cut him off with a small nod. I want them to show their true selves before they know who they're dealing with. He let the words sink in. This wasn't a request, it was an order. Marcus's plan wasn't childish payback. He knew exactly how the power game worked when people think you're nobody. They reveal who they really are, and once that mask falls, nothing can shield them from the consequences. One of the younger advisors frowned. But if they don't know your identity, they'll... Marcus cut him off with a thin smile, eyes locked on the contract in front of him. Do exactly what they did yesterday. And that's precisely what I want. The tension in the room thickened. Everyone understood Marcus wasn't just talking about a deal, he was building a stage. And when the curtain rose, those who had humiliated him would play their roles naturally, unscripted, unguarded, until they realized exactly who had been watching. He picked up his glass of water, slowly rotating it in his hand. We don't need to shout to teach them a lesson. We just let them speak freely. And then, Marcus set the glass down, meeting every pair of eyes in the room. We show them exactly whose hands their future now rests in. The oldest lawyer in the room let a small, knowing smile creep onto his face. He understood this wasn't just a financial acquisition. It was a humbling one that would cost their opponents dearly in pride and power. Marcus stood, adjusting his cufflinks, and ended the meeting with a single, sharp line, "Get ready. When this game starts, I don't want them to have a way out." And in that moment, everyone in the room understood Marcus wasn't just preparing to buy a bank. He was preparing to shatter the illusion of power they'd been living in for far too long. The next day, the sky was just as blue as yesterday, but Marcus was no longer the man he had been. The simple polo shirt was gone, replaced by a perfectly tailored deep navy suit that hugged his frame with quiet authority. The old watch, the symbol of his gritty startup days, had been left in a drawer. On his wrist now gleamed another timepiece, refined and glinting in the morning sun. There was no trace of the man they had dismissed. He stepped out of the car, flanked by an entourage, 2 lawyers carrying thick folders, a young assistant clutching a sleek black briefcase. They moved in sync, each step deliberate, like a procession rehearsed for this very moment. No one spoke, but their silence said everything. This was no ordinary customer. This was a force entering the building. The glass doors slid open, revealing the bank's grand lobby as bright and opulent as it had been the day before. But today, it wasn't a place meant to swallow Marcus whole with judgmental stares. Today, he walked in and every eye in the room snapped toward him. The receptionists froze, like they'd seen a ghost. Of course they recognized him. How could they not? The man they'd written off as a passerby, maybe even an interloper, was now standing before them as a figure of undeniable power. One receptionist lowered her head, lips parting to offer a greeting, but the words caught in her throat. Another forced a smile, awkward, almost apologetic. Marcus didn't reply. He didn't need to. Every click of his shoes against the marble floor was answer enough. The silence in the lobby thickened, heavy as a blanket draped over the room. Other customers whispered. Someone murmured, "Who is he? He must be someone important." Marcus knew exactly what they were thinking. They saw the suit, the entourage, the calm precision in his movements, and suddenly, they believed he belonged here. In this space they had decided only a day ago he was unworthy of. He stopped in the center of the lobby, letting his gaze sweep over the confused faces. And in that moment, Marcus smiled. A small, knowing smile, one meant for himself. "All right, let's begin." Because when you return as someone completely different, that's when the real game starts. The manager from yesterday was at the VIP counter, buried in a stack of documents. He looked up when he heard the echo of footsteps across the marble. His eyes locked on Marcus, no longer some guy in a polo, but a man flanked by lawyers, walking with the quiet power of someone who owned the room. For a moment, the manager's expression didn't change, but when memory caught up to reality, his face shifted confusion first, then recognition, then something closer to panic. He must have been thinking, "Is this really the same man from yesterday, or am I mistaken?" But when Marcus stopped right in front of him and met his eyes, there was no denying the truth. A receptionist quickly approached, her voice unsteady. "Good morning, Mr. Bell. The board is waiting for you in the main conference room." The name landed like a blade in the air. Mr. Bell. No longer sir. No longer a reminder that this is the VIP desk. Now, everyone in the lobby knew exactly who Marcus was. The manager froze, his face draining of color as if the blood had abandoned it entirely. Just 24 hours ago, he was the one who had told Marcus, "You can come back when you have the proper documentation." And now, the same man was back not to prove himself, but to sign the deal that would alter the course of the very bank he worked for. Marcus looked at him, a fleeting smile brushing his lips just long enough to unnerve him further. He didn't need words. His eyes said everything that needed to be said about yesterday. Around them, the other customers sat in stunned silence, some whispering to one another. They didn't know exactly what was happening, but they could feel it, a seismic shift in power. One woman near the VIP desk murmured, "Who is he? Why are they acting like this with him?" Marcus didn't answer anyone. Instead, he turned to one of his lawyers and gave a slight nod. The lawyer immediately stepped forward, addressing the reception desk. "We need to be escorted to the boardroom." The manager bowed his head, avoiding Marcus's gaze. In that moment, every trace of arrogance vanished. All that was left was a man trying to hide his shame. Marcus kept walking, leaving them in the storm of emotions they'd created for themselves. And he knew this quiet humiliation was only the prelude. The real unmasking was yet to come. He stopped at the counter, deliberately keeping himself no more than an arm's length from the manager. tilting his head slightly. Marcus locked eyes with the man, not rushed, not angry, just long enough to make him feel stripped bare. Then Marcus spoke, his voice low but cutting, each word like a hammer on stone. "So, am I qualified now?" The question came out soft as a breath, but it landed heavy as a blow. It wasn't just for the manager, it was for every pair of eyes that had judged him the day before. And Marcus didn't wait for an answer. He knew it didn't need one. The manager opened his mouth, inhaled like he might speak, then closed it. No apology, no excuse. Only silence, thick and choking, spilling out through his lowered eyes and clenched hands. Around them, employees pretended to be busy, though Marcus could feel their ears straining for every word. Even the customers in the waiting area sensed the shift in the air. An older man leaned toward his wife and whispered, "What's going on? Who is this man that has everyone frozen like this?" Marcus didn't answer. He only smiled, a thin smile equal parts mockery and peace. No one could guess how much of it was revenge and how much was satisfaction at seeing those who once dismissed him now cornered by their own behavior. He glanced around the lobby, as if addressing everyone at once. "Don't worry, I won't take up much of your time. I'm just here to finish some business." One of his lawyers nodded to the receptionist. Immediately, 2 staff members hurried to escort the group toward the private elevators reserved for high-level VIP clients. The path that had been slammed shut in his face yesterday now opened reluctantly like a forced greeting. Marcus walked forward without looking back, and in that moment, he knew true power wasn't in yelling or demanding apologies. It was in making them bow their heads in silence. The elevator doors closed. Quiet enveloped the space as Marcus leaned back against the polished wall, drawing in a deep breath. The smile never left his face. And one thought flickered in his mind: if this was just the opening act, the main event would make sure this entire bank never forgot his name. The VIP boardroom on the top floor of the bank was decorated like a declaration of power. A long, polished walnut table, imported leather chairs, and abstract paintings on the walls, the kind no one really understood, but everyone knew cost a fortune. In the center of the room, a crystal chandelier cast a soft glow over the negotiating table, creating an atmosphere Marcus had once been excluded from. But today, he wasn't just stepping inside. Today, he owned it. The bank's board of directors was already waiting. They rose to their feet as Marcus entered, faces once cold and accustomed to giving orders now bowing in an obligatory show of respect. The man at the center, the chairman, famous for never leaving his seat to greet anyone, stood up and extended his hand. "Mr. Bell," he said, "an honor to have you." Marcus shook his hand but said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence spoke louder than any words could. The others greeted him one by one, their voices attempting to sound casual but failing to hide the stiffness underneath. They knew who Marcus was: not a customer, not an ordinary investor, but the representative of Aurora Capital, the man holding in his hands the deal that could either save or sink this bank. Marcus pulled out a chair and sat, slow but deliberate. His lawyers and assistants stood behind him, ready to document every word, revise every line, if necessary. There was no trace left of the man who'd been dismissed at the VIP counter yesterday. He scanned the table. These faces, people who once believed they could measure a man's worth by his clothes or a passing glance, were now seated opposite him, trying to mask their unease behind professional facades. Marcus tilted his head slightly, letting the silence linger a little longer before finally speaking. "Shall we begin?" The sound of his voice marked the start of a chess match. The CFO cleared his throat and launched into numbers and reports, but Marcus just leaned back, arms crossed, eyes fixed on each speaker. He didn't need to interrupt. His silence forced them to fill the void, a void heavy with the power he now controlled. They thought they still owned the game, but Marcus knew in a few moves the entire board would be his. And when that happened, The people who believed they held the power would realize they never had it at all. Marcus didn't open with numbers. He didn't dive into terms, shares, or profits. He leaned back, laced his fingers on the table, and said slowly, "Before we talk about this deal, I want to tell you a story." The room froze. The chairman raised an eyebrow. A few directors exchanged glances, confused by such an unorthodox start, but Marcus didn't care. He looked directly at them and began. "Yesterday, I came to this bank. A man in a simple polo shirt walked up to the VIP counter for service. Instead of a greeting, I got a question, 'Are you sure you're in the right place?' And then a manager walked over, looked me up and down, and said, 'We only serve qualified clients. You can come back when you have the paperwork to prove it.'" A pause. Marcus smiled lightly, a smile sharper than any accusation. "Your customer service," he said, tilting his head as if savoring the words, "was unforgettable." No one laughed. No one dared. The words unforgettable landed like a razor's edge, no blood, but a deep cut all the same. The manager from yesterday sat in the corner, silent as stone. He knew Marcus was talking about him. Marcus didn't need to name names. Everyone understood. One young director adjusted his tie nervously, trying to break the tension, but no one followed. Marcus continued, his tone steady. "I walked out of here without saying a word, and today, I've come back not for an apology. I came back to remind you in business. A first impression can cost more than just one client. It can cost you your entire bank." His words weren't loud, but each one dropped like lead. The room was silent, not out of respect, but because people used to giving orders were suddenly dragged out of their comfort zone. Marcus let his gaze sweep the table, pausing on the chairman. "And now," he leaned forward, fingers interlaced, "let's talk about terms. But first, I want each of you to recall every detail of yesterday's customer service." He stopped there, letting the silence do its work. Marcus knew the sharpest words aren't shouted. They're the quiet stories that force people to feel the blade themselves. He picked up the pen lying in front of him but didn't open the folder. He leaned back, holding the silence for a few beats longer, letting the weight of his story sink in. When the room grew so tense that even a breath might break it, he spoke again. "Now, let's talk conditions." Everyone at the table tensed. The chairman gave a slight nod, signaling for the legal director to open the prepared documents. But Marcus lifted his hand, stopping him. "No, I'll go first." His voice was low, but the authority in it left no room for argument. "This deal benefits both sides. You need Aurora Capital. And we see the potential here, but before any signatures go on paper, I require one thing." He paused, letting his gaze cut across the table like a spotlight. "This bank will implement mandatory anti-racism training for every employee, from the board to the security guards at the door." The words fell like thunder. A few blinked, as if they'd misheard. The HR director leaned forward, ready to object, but froze when Marcus's eyes met hers. The chairman's brow furrowed, his hand flexing on the table a small, involuntary twitch of bruised pride. Marcus's tone stayed calm, which somehow made it hit harder. "I don't care what you think about it. I care that everyone in this building learns to see people as more than their skin color or their clothes. Because if you don't, there will be more yesterdays. And next time, you won't get Marcus Bell willing to sign a deal, you'll get someone ready to make sure the press knows everything." The room sank into heavy silence. It wasn't an open threat, but everyone understood. Marcus leaned back, drumming his fingers lightly on the armrest as if giving them time to digest the demand. He knew they'd find it hard to swallow it cut straight into their pride, forcing them to admit that a bank of their stature needed to relearn basic human decency. But he also knew they didn't have much choice. He tilted his head, a faintly mocking smile appearing on his face. "If you want this deal, this condition isn't up for negotiation." And in that moment, Marcus realized the people who thought they had the power were now forced to play by his rules. And this was only his opening move. Marcus didn't dive into numbers or terms. He left the file untouched on the table, laced his fingers together, and spoke with a slow, deliberate rhythm, each word plucking at the taut strings strung across the room. You know what the most ironic thing is? Marcus lifted his gaze, letting it sweep across every face. People like us, black people who walk into rooms like this, we are always expected to prove we belong. No one answered. He continued, We have to work twice as hard, measure every word twice as carefully, dress just right. Not too little to be dismissed, not too much to be labeled as showy. And even when we've far surpassed your standards, we're still just people who need to prove themselves. He paused. The silence was intentional, a step back that let his words echo in their heads. Yesterday, I came here not as a CEO. I came as a customer, and you looked at me like I didn't belong. Marcus tilted his head, a thin smile forming, one with no trace of joy. The funny thing is, if I'd walked in yesterday with this entourage and this suit, you probably would have offered me coffee and polite conversation. But I didn't. I wanted to see how I'd be treated with nothing but myself, and you gave me my answer. The manager from yesterday dropped his gaze, fingers twisting together in his lap. The chairman shifted in his seat but said nothing. Marcus lowered his voice as if confiding something, but every word landed heavy as lead. This isn't just about a transaction. It's about rooms like this. Rooms where people like me walk in braced for every judgment, every skeptical glance, every condescending word. He leaned back, letting the silence stretch a few more seconds. The air was thick enough to make every breath sound louder. And I want you to understand, the condition I've given you isn't a courtesy. It's an opportunity to change. Because if you don't, one day these rooms won't hold the value you're so proud of. Marcus let the words settle, offering no further explanation. Sometimes the weight of a message doesn't come from how it's said, but from how it forces the listener to confront themselves. And he knew, if he let the silence sit just a little longer, the pressure would become unbearable. Marcus drew a deep breath, letting the heavy air fill his lungs, a quiet way to steady his heartbeat. He'd been in rooms like this hundreds of times. Boardrooms, conferences, high-stakes negotiations, but today felt different. He thought back to all the years when silence had been his armor. When a teacher belittled him, he stayed quiet. When a store security guard searched him, he stayed quiet. When colleagues treated him like an outsider at corporate dinners, he stayed quiet. Not because he was weak, but because he knew some battles are only lost when you let anger define you. Silence had once been Marcus's survival strategy in a world that wasn't built to welcome him. But today, his silence wasn't endurance. It was a blade, sharper than any outburst could ever be. He scanned the faces at the table, catching every flicker of unease. A few busied themselves with papers, avoiding his eyes. They thought silence might protect them. But Marcus knew. In this room, silence only made them feel the weight of his words even more. He remembered something his mother told him on the walk home from a humiliating parent-teacher meeting. Sometimes, you don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to stand still and let them realize how small they are. He'd been too young to understand back then, but now, her words echoed through him as if she were sitting right there, smiling from the back of the room. He wondered how many black people had chosen silence like he once had, not because they couldn't speak, but because they knew their voices would be ignored or twisted, and how many had dreamed of a day when their silence could force others to listen. Marcus straightened, resting his hands lightly on the table. He didn't need to slam his fist or raise his voice. It was the calmness in his every move that pushed them closer to the edge. This was the moment he turned silence into a counterstrike, one that made no noise but left them with no choice but to retreat. And Marcus knew the people in this room would leave with a wound they'd never dare admit, but could never forget. They were beginning to see what they hadn't fully grasped before. Marcus Bell wasn't just an important client. He wasn't just a representative of a powerful investment firm. He was a man who could determine this bank's future, its reputation, its value, even its survival. The chairman, a man known for his unflappable composure, was now fighting to keep his breathing steady. He understood that what Marcus had just delivered wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum, wrapped in the velvet of calm authority. A new set of rules had been placed on the table, and if they wanted to keep playing, they had to obey. Marcus saw it all in their eyes. The chairman's tense brow, the HR director scribbling notes with a slightly trembling hand, the manager from yesterday sinking into his chair, avoiding eye contact like a scolded child. They all knew this meeting wasn't about a merger anymore. It had become a trial, and they were in the defendant's seat. Marcus knew exactly the power he held. He didn't need to threaten. The prolonged silence, the way he let them wrestle with their own thoughts, was the sharpest strike of all. "You need to understand," Marcus said, his voice steady and low, like he was reading an obvious truth. "This deal can lift you up, or drag you down deeper than you think, and the choice is entirely mine." No one objected. No one dared. Marcus watched their shifting expressions carefully. That was how he knew the balance had fully tipped in his favor. The people who once thought they could judge him by his skin or his clothes now understood they had judged the wrong man, and they were about to pay for it. He leaned back, a faint smirk crossing his face. "Sometimes power isn't in what you say. It's in making people realize exactly where they stand in the game." Marcus closed the folder in front of him, not rushing to discuss the next detail. He wanted them to sit there, in the heavy silence, fully aware that the man they had dismissed yesterday now had the power to rewrite their entire story. And once they understood that, they'd be willing to do anything to keep him on their side, even swallow the pride they once wore like a crown. The fountain pen lay waiting on the table, its gold trim glinting under the chandelier, as if it knew it was about to write a new chapter, not just for this bank, but for everyone in the room. Marcus picked it up and flipped to the last page of the contract. The air grew heavier. The chairman of the board sat upright, trying to maintain composure, but the light tapping of his fingers on the table betrayed his tension. The CFO swallowed hard, while the manager from yesterday, the one who told Marcus he didn't qualify, kept his head down, pretending to read the documents, though everyone knew he was simply avoiding Marcus's gaze. Marcus signed slowly. No rush, no emotion. But with each stroke of the pen, he knew exactly what was shifting. This was no longer just a contract. It was an indictment of the prejudices embedded in these walls. When the final stroke was done, Marcus set the pen down, spinning it lightly between his fingers before sliding it toward his attorney. That small gesture felt like a period, but also an opening a signal that this bank now had to place Marcus in a position they had never imagined co-owner of their future. The chairman drew in a long breath and extended his hand. "Congratulations, Mr. Bell. I trust we'll build a great future together." Marcus shook his hand. The man's grip was cold and soft, so different from the firm clasp of someone who once thought himself untouchable. In that moment, Marcus wasn't just shaking one man's hand. He was shaking hands with the entire system that once demeaned him, forcing it to accept him as an equal, if not as someone above it. He tilted his head slightly and said, "I hope so. But first, let's make sure you keep the condition I laid out." His words were soft, but everyone heard the weight of a binding commitment in them. Marcus released his hand and returned to his seat. He looked at the signed file, knowing it carried more than a massive sum flowing into this bank. It carried a price of honor. They'd been forced to pay a price no money could offset. He smiled, a smile no one could quite read victory or mockery. Because Marcus knew this signature didn't just change a deal, it would change how these power rooms saw people like him. And he also knew the game wasn't over. The most interesting part would begin after that seemingly polite handshake. Marcus turned toward the far end of the table, where yesterday's manager sat. The man tried to make himself smaller, as if silence could erase the memory of the day he'd thrown Marcus out of the VIP counter. But Marcus didn't let it slide. He stood, walking slowly toward him. All eyes followed, sensing the current rising. Marcus extended his hand, a fleeting smile on his lips. Shaking hands with staff isn't a problem, is it? The air froze. The words hit like a knock on the door of the manager's most shameful memory the moment he'd treated Marcus as just a customer out of place. The manager fumbled to his feet, his hand reaching out reluctantly, but before he could touch Marcus's, his eyes darted around, searching for an escape. There was none. The chairman was watching him with a rigid face. The other directors pretended to busy themselves with papers, but everyone had heard Marcus clearly. They all understood this wasn't a handshake, it was a reminder. Marcus gripped his hand firmly. Just for a few seconds, but enough to send a message. Yesterday, you thought I wasn't qualified to stand here. Today, you're shaking hands with the man who holds your job in his hands. He released the man's hand and returned to his seat, leaving behind a room flushed with red faces. No one dared speak. Marcus's smile wasn't loud triumph, it was thin, carrying both forgiveness and power. Good. Marcus sat, voice calm. Now we can talk about next steps. But to those in the room, that moment would haunt them longer than any clause in the contract. They had just witnessed a bitterly poetic reversal the man they'd humiliated yesterday had just forced them to stand, extend their hands, and bow their heads. Marcus didn't need to say another word. He knew they would replay this scene in their heads every time they thought of looking down on someone. And for Marcus, this was only the prelude, the real lesson was still to come. Marcus sat back in his leather chair, no longer a guest. He was the center of the room. Every glance, every breath, even the way they adjusted their ties or flipped their papers, revolved around him. The man who just yesterday was deemed out of place now held the kind of power that made an entire boardroom tread carefully. The chairman spoke, his voice aiming for firm and resonant, but carrying an edge of strain. Once again, we deeply appreciate your trust. Mr. Bell, the bank will fully honor the conditions you've set. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He let the words hang, forcing them to sit in the tension. Then, finally, he smiled faintly. I believe you will. 3 words, but enough to turn their gratitude into an oath they couldn't break. Marcus knew exactly where he stood now. He didn't need to remind them that Aurora Capital had just poured a massive investment into their institution. He didn't need to say that a single signature of his could sway their stock value. It was all there in his eyes, in the grounded confidence of his posture, in the silence that made them wait for his voice. The manager from yesterday no longer dared to sit upright. He kept his head down, scribbling notes on everything Marcus said, not for internal reporting, but to etch a lesson into his memory. Never underestimate a man just because he walks in wearing a simple polo. Marcus scanned the table, letting his gaze rest on each of them. Yesterday, some of you thought I didn't belong here. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to strike every ear. Today, I want you to remember this. I don't just belong here. I now hold part of its future. The room went dead silent. No one argued, no one dared. Marcus smiled, not in mockery, but like a man who'd walked a long, thorny road and finally stood at the peak. He knew this moment wasn't just his personal victory. It was a verdict on the prejudices this bank had stood for. And deep down, Marcus knew this power game wasn't ending here, it was only opening the door to bigger rooms, where even more people would have to relearn what it meant to truly see a man. The glass doors closed behind Marcus with a soft click, a sound that marked the end of a negotiation no one in that boardroom would ever forget. He stepped onto the bank's stone steps, where the late afternoon sun stretched across the pavement, catching on the flawless lines of his tailored suit. The sky was high and clear, a perfect contrast to the heaviness he'd just left behind. Marcus didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what was happening inside the directors trying to gather themselves. The manager from yesterday swallowing a shame he couldn't name, and the chairman rehearsing how to spin this deal as a win while everyone in that room understood the price they'd been forced to pay, a price no balance sheet could capture. But Marcus didn't walk away with gloating satisfaction. No victorious grin, no smug glance over his shoulder. What he felt was peace. Because he understood the greatest victory wasn't making them bow. It was leaving a permanent mark on how they'd treat the next person who walked through those doors. A breeze passed over his hair, carrying him back to memories of his younger self, the boy shadowed by store employees, doubted by teachers, searched by security for random checks. He'd carried those scars for years, and today, they weren't burdens anymore. They were armor. Marcus descended the steps, his shoes striking calm, steady notes against the stone. He didn't need to tell anyone he had won. Victory wasn't about shouting or humiliating. It was about turning silence into a weapon and yesterday's scorn into today's lesson. A young woman passing by glanced at him and gave a small, polite nod. The gesture made Marcus smile faintly. She probably didn't know who he was, or what had just unfolded inside that bank, but in that brief moment, Marcus felt it deeply. Every step he took, no matter how quiet, was clearing a path for someone else. He opened the car door, slid into the back seat, and leaned his head against the rest. He didn't have to look back to know the bank behind him would never be the same. And Marcus knew this wasn't an ending, it was the beginning of the changes he had just planted. The car eased into traffic, gliding past crowded streets and the glass tower he'd just rewritten. Marcus leaned against the seat, watching pedestrians rush by. In that moment, he wasn't just a businessman who had closed a deal. He was a man confronting his past and a world that had once defined him by his skin before ever seeing who he truly was. He murmured to himself, his voice low but deliberate, as if sending a message out into the air. Sometimes, silence cuts deeper than any shout, and it's enough to expose an entire system. Marcus thought back to that boardroom. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't humiliated anyone outright, but his calm, measured words and the unhurried way he held their gaze had shaken them more than any public indictment could. He hadn't needed to prove his power by standing over them. They had understood it when they found themselves bowing to his terms. Silence, the very thing he once used to survive years of condescension, had become his sharpest weapon. It wasn't loud, but it pierced right through the pride of people who thought themselves untouchable. Marcus wondered how many times had people like him stayed quiet to avoid trouble, to stay safe. How many voices had been swallowed because they knew no one would listen. And now, today, that very silence had forced an entire boardroom to confront itself. He smiled, not the grin of a victor, but the knowing smile of someone who had turned his former weakness into his greatest strength. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, etching the day's lesson into memory. This wasn't just for him. This was for everyone who would walk through those doors after him. Everyone still forced to prove they belonged in spaces that should have belonged to all. And Marcus understood, even if one day he wasn't here, his silence would echo a reminder that real power doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it stands unshakable. The phone rang, breaking the quiet. Marcus opened his eyes and glanced at the caller ID, a major European partner. He knew this wasn't a courtesy call, another deal, another battlefield. He answered, his voice calm and steady, Marcus Bell speaking. On the other end came quick greetings, blunt information, and massive numbers. Marcus listened, filed it away, but his mind still lingered in that boardroom on the proud faces that had been forced to bend. The sharp voices turned tentative, the weight of making an entire system confront itself. He ended the call with a scheduled meeting. Another deal awaited, but, for Marcus, deals weren't just about money or power anymore. They were opportunities to carve in stone a lesson he'd carried his whole life. Never judge a man by what you see on the surface. The car stopped at a light. The golden glow of the setting sun slipped through the trees, falling across his face. In the glass of the car window, Marcus saw his reflection, not just the boy once doubted in a grocery store, not just the man in a tailored suit who made a boardroom bow. He was both, past and present, forged into one. Marcus knew the battle today was over, but its echo would remain in those rooms for a long time. The directors would remember his gaze every time they judged someone by their appearance. That manager would never approach a counter without wondering, could this be another Marcus Bell? The car rolled on, leaving behind the building where he'd rewritten the rules. Marcus closed his eyes, letting the quiet cabin steady him. But inside, the fire still burned, not of anger, but of resolve. Tomorrow, he'd walk into another room, face another set of eyes, perhaps live the same story again, being judged, being underestimated. But Marcus knew what he'd do, what he had always done. He'd meet it with silence and the unshakable weight of truth. And in every room he entered, Marcus would leave behind a lesson they'd never forget. Real power doesn't live in appearances. It lives in the way a man stands firm against every gaze that tries to push him out. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.